Welcome to LabMinutes.com and our lab video series in Cisco ACS. You can find a complete list of ACS videos on the website by clicking on the link above and sign up for our newsletters to receive the latest video updates. In this video, we will configure Cisco ACS in a distributed environment. The concept of a distributed environment in Cisco ACS is actually simple. You have an ACS server that is a primary and potentially multiple ACS servers that are secondaries. All configuration changes have to be made on the primary, and the configuration will be replicated to all secondary servers. If the primary server fails and you need to make changes, you will have the ability to promote one of the secondaries to be a new primary, and everything just stays the same from there. So these are some of the things that we will try in this lab, and in addition to that, we're also going to move our log collector functions to a secondary and also perform some failover testing. Here's our lab setup. Here we have a primary Cisco ACS 5.4, the IPF.100. We have a fresh new install of our secondary ACS, the IPF.101. We also have a domain control in the same VLAN, the IPF.40. And for our test application, we're going to use our wire 802.1x to test our failover. And if you're wondering how we configure the wire 802.1x, I encourage you to check out our video SEC0099, ACS 5.4 wire 802.1x PEEP and EEP TLS with machine authentication videos. So the first thing we're going to do is to add our secondary ACS to our primary. Here we are logged into our web interface on our primary.100 and our secondary.101. And first we want to make a quick note as far as the certificate. So right now on the secondary, we did not install any additional certificate, and just to show you, all it contains is the default self-signed certificate. If you go under local certificate right here. And this is just to make you aware that the ACS of the primary and the secondary doesn't really need to trust each other as far as the certificate. What we can do is to go ahead and register the secondary ACS to the primary. So the way to do that is to get under operations and local operations, deployment operation. And here we can specify the primary instance. So we're going to do that based on IP, which is 172.16.32.100. And for our username is ACS admin. Just make sure you use that correct username and not the CLI username, which is just the admin, and then your corresponding admin password. Okay, then we can click on register to primary. We'll click OK. And now we can hop over to our primary and check on the status of the newly added secondary. Under System Administration Operations and Distributed System Management, you can see right here we have our secondary instance showed up for LMS ACS SEC at the IP of 32.101. Status online, and replication currently is pending. And right now the secondary ACS is going to go through a service restart. So what we can do is to SSH to both of our primary. So let me log in first. And then show application status. And I'm only going to do this just to show you when it comes up the difference as far as the list of services that the primary and secondary be running. So show application status ACS, this is for primary, and then I'm going to log into the secondary, although it's going to take a couple more minutes for the secondary to restart. Again, show application status ACS. As you can see right here, we're going to have to wait for that to come back up. But while that's happening, let's go back to our page here and make a quick note as far as what kind of operations can be performed on the secondary node. Obviously you can edit, click on that, and you can launch GUI. There's not much you can do there. You can delete when you're done, or if you want to remove your secondary or decommission your server, you can activate it if it becomes inactive. You can deregister. You can promote it to a primary if you wish to replace your current primary server. And you can also force full replication as well as performing config backup from this just one particular page. Okay, and obviously if you have multiple secondary servers, you'll be kind of stacking up on this list right here. Okay, now we're just going to have to wait for a moment for the secondary to come back up. Okay, so now it looks like the replication has been completed, and now if we go back onto the CLI on the secondary ACS, you can see if you do again show application status ACS, all of the services are now running. Although when you compare that to the primary, you can see the number of services is far less. It's almost half of the number of services, and this is because the majority of the functions are being run off the primary. So let's log into our secondary ACS. using ACS admin. Just go through and do some sanity checks as far as things like network devices. You can see all the network devices that we have in the primaries now show up on the secondary, and also make a quick note at the bottom here. All you can do is view, and you cannot create or make any kind of changes or edit. And this is because all of the changes are supposed to be done from the primary. Just compare the page here. And if you now go under System Administration and look at Local Operation and Deployment Operations, you can see most of the functions that's also available on the primary distributed system management page that you can perform on the secondary. You can also initiate it from the secondary node itself using this page right here, where there is a deregister from primary, backup, promote to primary. Or you can also request local mode if you want to make temporary local changes and forceful replication. Okay, now the next thing we're going to do is to add our secondary ACS to AD, and that way it can perform authentication when failover happens. So if you go under External Identity Stores, Active Directory, then you can see by default it's not joined to the domain, although the primary has already been joined. So we click Join Test Connection, and now domain is labminutes.com. Username, we have an account created called ACS_AD, and then password, we test connection, we get all green checks. That means we're good to proceed with the join. Okay, so while that's happening, we can go back to our primary ACS, and on here, if you go under also Active Directory, and under the machine access restriction right here, general, just to make a quick note also here, we now have the ACS secondary joined and connected to the domain, so that we know that if we go back to our secondary GUI, the connected status has changed to connected. Okay, so if you do machine authentication and user authentication as part of your, where there's wire wireless 802.1x authentication in your environment, you would have come in here and enabled machine access restrictions already, but something that is new on Cisco ACS 5.4 is to allow that MAR cache to be distributed to all of our secondary nodes. So back in the 802.1x video, we have already configured a cache distribution group called LMR group, and we now just need to add the secondary nodes to that group for the MAR cache to be replicated. So when the failover happens, which we will perform later on in this lab, we know that the user did not have to be forced through the machine authentication again. Okay, so now we're going to configure that group for our secondary ACS, and then we save the change. And we can always go back to our secondary ACS and look at that. You can see right here, change has been propagated almost instantaneously, and now it is being part of that LMR group for the cache. Okay, the next thing I want to show is under the certificate authority. And you can see here, as part of the replication, the root certificate has also been distributed from the primary down to secondary. So here we have our LM root CA, which is our self-signed root CA for our CA servers that the ACS can use later on to authenticate our 802.1x client. So at this point, what you would proceed is generating a CSR and have that signed by our certificate server, because that certificate has to be unique per server and it would not have been propagated from the primary. So again, if you go back under the local server certificate, you can see we are currently still using the self-signed certificate that came installed by default. But we're going to skip that process, but you would definitely want to do that when you work on your production server. Okay, so now that we have successfully joined our secondary ACS to the primary, the next thing we're going to do is to move our log collector roles from the primary to secondary. But before we do anything, I want to show you that if you're trying to launch a monitoring and report, whether it's from primary or secondary, here we're trying to do it from the secondary. You can see it gets redirected back to a 32.100, although we're trying to launch it from the 101. And this is because the secondary knows that it's the primary that's performing the locking function at this point. And if we go ahead and trying to re-authenticate, so I'm going to bring up my client PC here that we did the 802.1x on. Just going to go ahead and disable and enable, and we're trying to check on the log just to make sure that is currently working with radius authentication. And right here you can see we have a successful user authentication that just came in. So now what we're going to do is to move that log collector role to our secondary, and this is something that is also recommended as it helps to kind of move some of the loads to a secondary server. So here under the system administrations, and then you have log configuration, and there's an option for log collector. You can see by default the log collector server is our primary. So now we can change it to pretty much any secondary server that you'd like. Since we have only one, we're going to select our ACS SEC here, and once you click on set log collector, there's a little informational messages just to confirm you about what you're about to do, and then we click OK to continue. And now we're just going to have to wait, although the changes is somewhat reflected on the server, a primary server already, secondary being a log collector server. Let me close this page down, and we're just going to have to give it a second here since the server has to go through a restart, and we're just going to have to monitor it from our SSH session with the command. You can see some of the services in the primary has already gone through a restart. So now it looks like all the services came back, and if you compare again the secondary to the primary, the services in the secondary is now show up with additional processes since we has migrated the log collector role from the primary to the secondary. And now if you're trying to log into the secondary, since the process got restarted, and then trying to launch the monitoring and report one more time, and you can now see it no longer goes to the 32.100. And even if we're trying to launch it from the primary, we should be redirected to 32.101 right here as well. Okay, and now if we just to do another quick test on our 802.1x client here to force the user to re-authenticate, and then we'll go to AAA protocols and radius authentication, and you can see that here we have a successful 802.1x user authentication. So we now know that the role migration for log collector has been successful. So far, although we have the secondary ACS up and running, we haven't really started using it yet, and that's because we have not really pointed any network devices to it. So now the next part of the lab that we're going to do is to test the failover for our 802.1x. So the first thing we need to do is to make a switch aware of the secondary server. So we need to add it to our radius configuration. So first let's do AAA radius, and this is for the COA just in case, although it's not really needed for what we're doing here. So 32.101 with the server key of Cisco, and then we redefine our secondary ACS server with the radius server host command 32.101. And just to make sure, it could be something that we set already in the previous video, and we want a timeout to be 2 seconds, so make sure the failover happens in timely fashion. So let me clear the screen, and the next thing we're going to do is to force another machine authentication, and this is to make sure that the MAR cache has been distributed from the primary and the secondary, since we have gone through a service restart on the secondary during the log collector row change, just to make sure that MAR cache is there and not lost when those services restarted. So let's log into our client one more time, and machine authentication should be happening right now. And looking at the status, we should have had both successful machine and user authentication. So let's reload our page. We can see in the log here we have a successful machine and user authentications. So now what we can do is to take our primary ACS off the network by disconnecting the VM network adapter. Click OK, and here from the switch we can try to ping just to confirm the primary ACS. You can see it's no longer pingable. Now if we go back to our client test machine and force another user authentication without having to go through machine authentication, here it looks like it's still trying to authenticate. And if you go back and look at, it's already failed, looks like. And if you go back and look at the log, and that's confirmed a failed authentication. If we scroll to the right, the failure reason we have the TLS handshake failed because client rejected ACS local certificate. Now, if you recall earlier, we did not go through with a CSR and certificate signing process, so the secondary ACS still continue to use its default self-signed certificate, which is not trusted by the client. and that's what the client is complaining. And just to let the client go through the authentication process, what we can do is to change authentication setting to not have the client validate the server certificate for now. And once we do that, go disable and then enable. You can see here that now the client went through a authentication process successfully, and to confirm on our log, here we have a successful authentication. And if you look at the detail, expand the steps all the way down, you can see here the ACS set has confirmed the previous successful machine authentication. And this is due to the mark hash that was distributed from the primary, secondary, and this happened at the time when the machine authentication happens. So now let's say that while our primary ACS is not available, we would like to add another network device. So if we go to our secondary ACS and attempts to do that, obviously you cannot do so because all the configuration needs to be made on the primary node. So in order to do that, what we need to do is to promote our secondary to be a primary, and that is done under local operation and then deployment operations. And if you scroll down, there's a button for promote to primary, so we're going to go ahead and click on that, and then we confirm the action. And then we can check on distributed system management. You can see here the primary instance is now become a ACS SEC, and the ACS PRI has been put under the secondary instance. Okay, now if we go back to the network devices, we have capability to create a new network device. So let's go ahead and create a new device called SW2, and then select the proper location. Just go ahead and give it an IP address, although the device doesn't really exist in the network. Let's say it has an IP of 0.2. Also configure TACX, and then submit. And now let's assume that we are ready to bring our primary or the old primary back online, or the ACS PRI that we removed from the network previously. Connect it back to the network and trying to access the distributed system management. You can see it still thinks itself is the actual active primary because it was not aware of the promotion action that was completed on the secondary. And obviously the changes that we made on the ACS SEC does not show up on the PRI node. So now in order for the new configuration to be replicated back to this particular node, what we have to do is to connect it back to now current active primary, which is our SEC. And to do that, it's just exactly like how we originally registered our secondary node to the primary, and that's under local operation, deployment operation. We're just going to type in the IP of our active primary node, which is 101, and then ACS admin, and then click register to primary. And now it's given us a failure message as far as there's a conflict of the node existence, because this particular node is currently acting as a primary and has a secondary somewhat registered to it, although it's not really active. Because if we go back to distributed system management, it's to have this secondary node right here. So what we need to do is to deregister and then delete. Looks like it doesn't like that because the SEC is still, or the primary still thinks this SEC is a lock collector node. So one thing that we can also try here, let's see if it works or not. Go to distributed system management and then delete our PRI from that, and then let's try and register it one more time. And looks like that seems to work, because if you come back here and refresh, and now the ACS PRI has joined back into a distributed environment. Although this time it's becoming a secondary instance, and replication status, that should turn updated soon. You can see the node has gone through a service restart, so just have to give it a couple minutes for that to come back. And when we check the services, looks like everything is back up and running. So now we can log into our ACS PRI. You can see in parentheses here it's still acting as a secondary. So ACS admin. And let's go ahead and check our network devices. And at this point, as you can see, switch 2 that was created on the active primary is now replicated to our secondary node here. And also if you look at the distributed system management, we have a good replication status. So now we're pretty much back the way we were, but with the primary and secondary role switched between the ACS PRI and SEC. So let's go ahead and return or restore those roles to a proper server. So what we can do on our active primary, which is ACS SEC, we can click on ACS PRI and promote it to a primary role. And now you can see the role has been switched. And at the same time, if we refresh this page, we have now regained the ability to configure the ACS from our ACS PRI. Okay, it doesn't even require a service or any kind of service restart. So if you do show application status ACS, and that's on SEC, and here you just do up arrow, and all of the services you can see stays at the running state. So there was absolutely no service restart required when we switch between the primary and secondary role, or when you do the promote to primary. And now since we had to, when we join our ACS PRI back to the distributed cluster, we had to restart the services, which means our mar cached must have been lost as well, and we can easily confirm that by forcing another user authentication just to confirm the behavior of our mar cache. You can see the user can no longer authenticate, and if we check the authentication log right here, the one that failed in red, and look at the steps, here we have a red message about ACS cannot confirm the previous successful machine authentication. So as you can see, it looks like the mar cache distribution only happens when the machine authentication happens, but not during where there is a replication or even forceful replication. You just have to keep in mind that the secondary ACS can still lose those mar caches if there's a, for example, a service restart, and it would not have the machine authentication cache until the next time the machine authentication happens, or if the failover happened before then the user will still need to be forced to lock out or shut down just to go through the machine authentication again. But nevertheless, it's still better than the previous version where we did not even have those mar cache distribution feature at all. Okay, so that wraps up our video on ACS 5.4 distributed deployment. You can visit our website to view an extensive list of our lab videos and sign up to get access to additional lab contents. Thank you for watching LabMinutes.com, and I'll see you guys in the next video.